Hey Graham, how are you?
What's up, Jamie?
Good to talk to you. Good to talk to you again. It's slightly odd because this is one of the only conversations I'm doing in this series where I've actually spoken to the person before. So it's nice to talk to you again, albeit remotely.
Nice to be here.
You know this better than anybody because your post-production skills are invaluable in smartening up my rough and amateur videos and podcasts. So you know this already. But for the people listening and watching, welcome to Sentientist Conversations. And it's really a series of conversations about the two deepest questions in philosophy, I guess. What's real? What should we believe in? And how should we choose to believe? But also what matters morally? And where should we draw our moral circle or our moral polygon or whatever shape you want it to be? So sentientism, as you well know, is this really simple, pluralistic worldview that says when we're thinking about what's real, we should use evidence and reason, a naturalistic way of understanding reality and engaging with reality. And when it comes to what matters, the clue is in the name, that we should think about sentience, the capacity to experience things, suffering, flourishing, as the way we set our moral boundary. And we should do that so that no suffering is excluded in simple terms. So that's really what sentientism lays out. But these conversations are about how the people I'm speaking to answer those two questions, what's real and what matters. So it's going to be fascinating to explore that with you. But before we go on to those questions, for people who don't know you already, how would you introduce yourself and your focus in life?
Yeah, so I'm an artist, a background in photography, but I've been currently focusing in post-production, as you mentioned. And yeah, in general, I guess I have a range of interests from philosophy to art and science, effective altruism, and recently I've really developed an interest in what you're working on with sentientism.
Yeah, great. Well, good to talk. So if we start with the first of those two deep questions, what's real? It'll be interesting to know your own personal philosophical journey so far. So for many people, this conversation starts with, I guess, their upbringing and how they grew up. Did they grow up in a naturalistic or an atheistic environment or in a more religious or a different type of cultural environment? So it'd be great to sort of understand your story and where you've got to so far on how to choose what to believe.
So I was raised in a Christian environment, and I have to say it was a very loving environment. And I think that my parents' expression of God's love was really their expression of their own love, raising my brother and I. My primary involvement was the choir. I had some theological study, but it wasn't my primary involvement. I have to say it was more the music and that sort of thing.
I won't ask you to sing, but...
I know, right? Yeah, I was voice soprano, so it's...
You've gone a couple of octaves deeper now.
Yeah, there was actually a period where, we were touring England, and my voice switched right during the tour, and so I think I went from a soprano to a bass.
Wow! While you were on the tour.
Yeah.
You have to learn all the new parts and stand in a different place.
So, it didn't start to become, I guess, more problematic to me until having conversations with some people of that community where, for example, in discussions concerning, heaven and hell, I remember one girl saying, regrettably, her Jewish or, Muslim friends were going to hell and things like that. And that really stuck with me. And I think things like that were the seeds to really questioning that body of knowledge and ethics. And so...
And the tension there between your parents' natural, deep, rich compassion and probably a pretty universal compassion, and then the somewhat casual comment by your friend that, people who believe the wrong things or don't believe at all will be tortured for eternity as though that's a good thing. Yeah, it's a strange balance.
It is a strange environment, especially for, a kid, I think. And so it wasn't really until studying comparative religion in college that I began to think more deeply about, some of the logical contradictions, how strict interpretation of monotheism isn't really consistent with polytheism, or even just how Christians are generally quite atheistic towards some of the older, Greek gods and things like that.
Yeah.
And also, but on a more serious, moral point, all the theodicies presented to me, which are basically explanations for things like the problem of evil, were never honestly very satisfying to me. I never found them convincing.
Yeah, those explanations often seem to end up in the ineffable nature of God, and we were not designed to understand him or her or it, and they move in mysterious ways. Yeah, I don't find much intellectual satisfaction in those answers either. But
And then so subsequent to that, I encountered some of the new atheist writings, such as Daniel Dennett's Religion as a Natural Phenomena, Sam Harris's Moral Landscape. Also, just in general, read more evolutionary biology, like Stephen Jay Gould. And I think it's just increasingly the picture of the naturalistic worldview just became more and more, salient to me. Yeah. However, I should say, on the flip side of that, also in reading Karen Armstrong, which is also a comparative religion author, writers such as her focus on the compassionate unifying elements of religious tradition as well. So if there's one productive way forward between both interfaith dialogue and also secular science faith dialogue, that it really should be, as you're promoting in your work, this focus on compassion.
Yeah. I think that's deeply important. And as much as anyone, I can fall into the trap of being a little bit snarky or a bit dismissive about religious ideas, partly because, I have that same sort of epistemological challenge about the incoherence or the conflicts in just the logic and the thinking, but also because I do think some of the ethics can be very warped and very damaging. And I'm, enormously robust at standing up for people who are oppressed by some of those belief systems. I think that's really important what you say, is that actually there's such a rich vein of genuine, deep compassion that flows through most religious systems and most religious people that, I think most religious individuals are more moral than the formal structures of the church or the book they purport to follow or the priests and, who run their churches. And I think working on that common basis of compassion and talking about how to expand and extend that and how to, move into a position where we build on that compassion and make it less conditional and less exclusive and others and tribalism, I think is a much more productive way to go than just dismiss the whole thing. Because there's enormous meaning that people find in the community and the culture and the tradition and that compassion. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be pretty strident and robust when the ethics fall off the rails. So. But no, that's been interesting to hear. And one of the reasons that we talk about a lot in this series of conversations is, okay, if we don't have that sort of supernatural basis for our morality and our ethics, what are our ethics grounded on? So some people will, because they're scared by the answer to that question, they're worried about losing their moral roots, will sort of double down and go back to a religious or a supernatural worldview, even if they don't technically believe in the supernatural stuff anymore. They sort of hang on to that because they're nervous about losing their grounding. Other people will go to almost another extreme of relativism and say, well, okay, there is no grounding to morality. It's just something that we negotiate in different groups. And who am I to judge the morality of one set of people over another, regardless of whether it causes enormous suffering? It's purely relativistic, which I see as a somewhat insidious way of thinking. But I don't think you followed either of those paths. So how would you describe the grounding of your morality in that naturalistic way of thinking? What matters to you?
It didn't become really, I guess, formal exercise until college. A primary influence was studying Peter Singer's work.
Yeah.
In that he views ethics as a body of knowledge that can be revised over time, and that the truths that we can discover about morality are truths that can be developed through reason and critical reflection.
Yeah.
And so that really resonated with me.
Yeah. And one of the interesting implications of that approach, because I think many people will follow that line, but they can still draw their moral circle in very different ways. So some people would echo everything that you and I have said so far, but they would still draw their moral circle around a subset of the human race, leading to all sorts of interhuman discriminations that we're still struggling to suppress and resist now. But one of the other big steps is, okay, at what point do you realize that humans aren't the only things that suffer, and therefore there's an implication for broadening our moral circle beyond the human species? So how early did that become a factor for you? Again, was that reading Singer's work? And
Singer's work was definitely the primary catalyst. Of course, I was aware of animal suffering. Oh, well, actually, I can point to a very specific moment, which was studying in elementary school. I studied Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. I think it was like 5th grade. And that talks about factory farming. I don't know if you're aware of the work.
I haven't heard it.
So that was probably my initial exposure to the idea of factory farming. But, being in elementary school, I don't think I...
It's quite young to come across those ideas.
But when I encountered Singer, that's when I really had to face those ideas head on. And even in that case, I still put it out of my mind, right? There were
Yeah.
years where I just didn't think about it. And I think it wasn't until the documentary called Earthlings
Yeah.
that I really, truly digested, what was going on. I think sometimes it just takes something like that, just seeing direct documentary footage. It was just very powerful. And
It's almost like you can't hide from it anymore.
yeah,
Yeah.
after watching that and subsequently rewatching, many of Singer's lectures, I decided that, I really had to change my lifestyle and that I didn't think what was going on was morally justifiable.
Was that quite an easy process practically? And was it quite an easy process socially? How did it feel to actually make those adjustments?
The initial transition was probably a bit cognitively difficult because I didn't want to do it
Yeah.
because of convenience. But once I felt that firm conviction about the ethics, it actually wasn't hard at all. It was a bit hard in the beginning because I didn't want to do it. But once I made the transition, it was actually quite easy. And then socially, I would get all sorts of shit about it. But actually, the social thing, it didn't bother me as much because at that point, you have that footage in your mind, right?
Yeah.
And it's no longer a joke and it's no longer a difficult decision.
Yeah. So it's almost as if the level of ethical conviction you had, once you decided to act in line with those ethics, gave you that sort of confidence to push through the social challenge. And yeah. But I think that seems common in lots of people I've spoken to, is that when you look forward to it, and I went through that period of deliberately not thinking about the topic for much longer than you did. I mean, my journey was painfully long and of course is never complete either, right? Because none of us have reached some sort of perfect ethical end state, but just the really obvious stuff like dropping animal products wherever you can. That took me a long while to get to. But I think for many people, it feels quite daunting when you look at it before you do make the change. Again, socially or practically, you're not sure how it's going to work. You know people are going to look at you like you're a weirdo. But once you've taken the commitment, you've taken the decision and you've dived into the cold water, you look back and think, why didn't I do that earlier? And it was, remarkably easy. So, but it is amazing how something that seems so ethically obvious can feel quite daunting and quite difficult and quite socially unusual to do. And that's another theme that comes through a lot of these conversations is, on the one side, there's evidence, reason, and universal compassion, and it somewhat seems almost tautologically self-evident and obvious. And then on the other side, you have the dead weight of social norms and tradition and people thinking you're strange, and that really acts as an incredible break, even on topics that I think technically seem quite straightforward. There are many really complex philosophical questions in the world that we'll be arguing about forever, but there are some really, really obvious basic things. And I think to you and me, this seems like one, but most of the people on the planet disagree.
Most people don't like the idea of animal suffering, but because it's so ingrained, I would say the primary response is typically something like, well, can they suffer, really? I mean, or is it quick, or that sort of thing. I would say many people take a default of almost like a necessary evil or something like.
Yeah.
And as long as it's quick or if it's painless or whatever, then it's okay. But I would say to that, look, I had the exact same feelings, but I would ask you to look at that footage with your heart of hearts directly.
Here's one.
Yeah. Oh, there's Luna. What's up, Luna?
Gonna say hello. She's a bit sleepy. We had a good run earlier, so. But yeah, I have a high degree of confidence in her sentience, right? Look into her eyes and. Oh, hello. Who's that? Oh, you even got a meow. That's nice.
In reflecting on that capacity for sentience and just, looking directly at that footage, I think we should ask ourselves, is there any justification for such treatment?
It's an indication of the depth of the cognitive dissonance. Any vegan on Twitter is very used to all of these arguments, right? But whether it's we did it for millions of years, it's natural, it's socially normal, animals don't suffer, even if they do suffer, they're killed humanely, they have a net positive life before they die, I've even had people bite the bullet and say, farming human toddlers would be ethical if they had a net positive life. I'm like, my God,
Wow.
if you're willing to go to these lengths of intellectual gymnastics to justify this thing, it's probably an indication that you're fighting a losing battle. And I think there is a degree to which the moral battle is over, right? I mean, the answer is so incontrovertible and clear. Most of the ethical arguments are no longer driven by ethics. They are just desperate attempts to reverse engineer some form of justification for what society thinks is normal. I think the ethical battle is over, and I think it's more a question now of just finding ways of making it much easier for 8 billion people to bring their actions in line with, as you hinted at, the sort of latent ethics they already have, which is needlessly causing suffering is bad. So we've almost got to, I think there are some people for whom ethical argument still works, right? They'll see a documentary or they'll have a discussion and a light will go on and their sense of moral conviction will take over and they'll change. But that's quite a small percentage of the population, and we'll be working for a long, long while if that's the only lever we're pulling. And that's the next section of our conversation really, is about thinking about a more sentientist future. We might not like it, right? We'd love the sheer force of ethical argument would change more people's minds. But I think given the dead weight of social norms, we're also going to have to make it easy for people to upgrade their ethics by providing alternatives and frankly by normalizing this way of thinking, which is one of the motivations behind us working on this project together, is just to make people realize that rationality and a broad sentiocentric compassion are increasingly getting closer to the mainstream. So people need to jump on board before it's no longer edgy and cool. But that would be a good next stage of the conversation really, is to think about, if we can move towards a future where more of the 8, becoming 9, maybe 10 billion people on the planet adopt a more naturalistic way of engaging with reality and broaden their moral circle to recognize the value of all sentient beings. How do you think about that future? And again, some of your personal interests will play into this, but I'm interested both in the sort of short and medium term, but also, if you like, a sort of sci-fi future about where we might be able to get to if we shift towards a more sentientist world.
So I think definitely a future of both the cell-based and plant-based alternative products is, as you said, essential for making the transition easy and available. I do think we should be ashamed that factory farming still exists. In the long run, I think we should move away from animal agriculture altogether and help fund animal sanctuaries and allow these beings to just live out their lives outside of that entire context of objectification and exploitation.
Yeah.
I would hope that post-COVID, we take the zoonotic risks more seriously, acknowledge the relationship between animal exploitation and COVID.
Yeah, it's around 2/3 to 70%, I think, comes from, if not animal farming, intensive animal farming or hunting or, some form of animal exploitation has driven zoonotic disease. I think it's that proportion. It's enormous.
Wow.
And it's interesting you mentioned factory farming specifically, because of course there is, there's bad and even worse in animal farming. But while, most people who consume animal products will disagree with you and me about ending animal farming completely, to your earlier point, there's still common ground we can work on together, even with people who consume animal products. And factory farming is a great instance because
most people are against it.
Yeah, a substantial proportion of meat eaters who think factory farms are awful and should be shut down. And you can see some of the initiatives that are going on in Switzerland with the petition work that Sentients Politics are doing there, and the bill that Cory Booker's trying to bring forward in the US. Factory farming is becoming acceptable almost in the mainstream to consider shutting it down completely. And again, while it might feel difficult to work with people who still think animal farming could exist in a viable way, if we're really interested in driving down that inexorable curve of slaughter and billions of farmed animals, then finding common cause around the most egregious instances like factory farming, I think there's a lot of, again, latent ethics there we can tap into, because many people see them as awful. So
absolutely.
Yeah, and the point on the zoonotics is interesting as well, as is the climate change challenge. So, I've argued that even if you're a human who only cares about the human species, you should still go vegan, because the zoonotic disease argument, anti-microbial resistance and climate change, such a threat to humans anyway, that even if you have zero moral consideration for farmed animals, there's still a really strong argument to end animal farming. So
Absolutely.
So yeah, again, there's common ground, I think, in many of those topics that we can work on.
I do think some of the longer term goals should include extending legal personhood in the context where it makes sense. I think taking wild animal suffering, something we should be taking seriously, which is currently quite neglected. There's some great work being done with an organization called Animal Ethics and Wild Animal Initiative on that.
Yeah, many people are very hesitant about the wild animal topic, partly because I think rightly they're very nervous about this sort of human hubris about intervening in nature, although of course we do that at catastrophic scale already, so I'm not sure why that should be a reason for hesitation. But given the complexity of ecosystems and our weak understanding of what goes on in those, I can understand that we need to be prudent, but that doesn't justify excluding wild animals from our moral circle. That just means we should be do more research and be prudent and be cautious about how and whether we intervene. So,
absolutely. And I think, frankly, in a similar way to the cognitive dissonance, I experienced in thinking about things like factory farming. Yeah, I thought about wild animal suffering, but frankly, if you take the principle that all suffering matters morally, then I think it is something we should think critically about. And I agree, it has to be approached with incredible prudence.
Yeah. And I think it links to something that we see even within human ethics, where there's this temptation to say, because this topic is complex, or because I don't feel I can have an impact on it, we shouldn't worry about it at all. And I'm like, well, that doesn't work in human ethics, right? Just because you don't know how to help with some remote humanitarian conflict, you don't just cut those people out of your moral consideration. They're still morally, that suffering is still morally salient, even if you're unsure about how and whether to help. And I think that's a really important distinction to make is, fine, let's deal with these really complex, difficult, tricky problems, and let's do that in a prudent way and so on. But don't respond by just carving, trillions of sentient beings out of your moral consideration in the first place. Because as soon as you do that, you have no motivation to even think about a solution.
I know we've had personal discussions about effective altruism and what is the best use of one's time and energy and resources. I mean, it's even in that community where there's so much critical thought going on, it's not easy, right? It's not clear. And so I think that also applies in the non-human context.
Yeah, I agree. And the effective altruism movement is fascinating because, as you say, there's an enormous diversity of opinion within that movement about how to do the most good, and even the level of demandingness we should apply to ourselves, which is a tricky balance to achieve as well. But I think that's an important point about the naturalistic stance, is that it doesn't imply, there is one reality, we all share it, therefore there's one set of facts that we all agree on, and, it almost becomes a naturalistic dogma in its own right. Maybe we'll get there at some point. And of course, over time, you would hope there would be convergence because we're developing different forms of evidence about one reality we do all share. But in practical terms, there's loads of different types of evidence, loads of different weightings of importance of evidence, loads of different perspectives that we have because, we have different inputs to our information processing architecture and we've all lived in very different ways. And there's different ways of reasoning about things as well. I mean, there's no, sort of one perfect incontrovertible logic. So the diversity of opinion and the, richness of disagreements amongst effective altruists or sentientists is breathtaking and quite innovating, I find.
Yeah, and actually, I would say that diversity is, in a way, essential, and that actually is a perfect transition into. You mentioned, sort of sci-fi future or far future. One author I know has been brought up briefly on the podcast, but I want to reemphasize is that of David Deutsch, who is a philosopher of science who's written on the relationship between knowledge, creativity, and progress. How every field of knowledge, whether it's economics or medicine or positive psychology or politics, these are all bodies of knowledge which, through continual criticism and all those debating perspectives and creativity, is a continual process of revision and progress. It in a way, it seems like almost a very simple view, like, oh yes, progress can continually occur, but he grounds it in such a rigorous and compelling way in epistemology and philosophy of science and history. It's hard to summarize quickly, I'd say check it out. Watch some of the videos, check out his work. So that would be one author that I'd say is pretty inspiring.
Yeah, I find that work fascinating as well. And it's not naive at the same time, right? It doesn't pretend that all problems will be solved and we can't make catastrophic mistakes and we might not wipe ourselves out or do awful things. It's not naive in that context of a sort of an incontrovertible positive progress that always moves forward and nothing can ever go wrong, right? But I think it's still fair to say, even in these troubled times, that for the average human, it's probably, one of the best times to have been alive in human history. It's certainly not true of non-human animals, but it seems fair to say of humans. But that progress is incomplete and many awful, awful problems remain. And it's uncertain whether we'll be able to continue. And even if we do, it's bumpy and halting. And, we shouldn't give up on trying to move those things forward. But
the view is essentially that problems are inevitable, but what we're trying to do is get to better problems. And that's progress.
Yeah. And his vision of, again, the sort of sci-fi view of where you could end up if we manage to avoid wiping ourselves out as sentient beings is also somewhat mind-blowing, because I think he sets out a view that if something's possible within the laws of physics, the only thing that's stopping us being able to achieve it is access to the requisite level of information. And again, that takes you to some quite strange places when you start thinking about the long-term future. But yeah, sort of a fascinating world of possibility opens up, I guess.
That knowledge includes compassion, right? The compassionate project is as grand as we aim for, right? And that gets back into what we were saying about it can feel overwhelming looking at a problem like wild animal suffering because of the numbers. But it doesn't mean, in principle, it's out of reach. And I think we should be thinking very broadly and thinking long-term about the reach of compassion. So that's, and I have a lot of respect for people like Magnus, who I know we may have on your podcast.
I'd love to, yeah, Magnus Vinding, yeah.
Yeah, who, is trying to do a lot of really fundamental search in that area to see what might be possible.
Yeah. There are lots of different views about how to alleviating suffering of all sorts. So they'll be thinking about human ethics and global poverty and disease and equality. They'll be thinking about wild animal suffering. They'll be thinking about farmed animal suffering and, these sources of catastrophic, awful and largely needless suffering in the world today. And, those are the priority causes. Others will, and I think some in the transhumanism movement are a little bit guilty of this, saying, oh, that's just sort of dull day-to-day detail. I'm interested in this sort of elitist far future where I can enhance my own lifespan and my own quality of my sentience and, go and explore the galaxies and so on. I'm like, okay, fine. But so I'm painting a bit of a caricature, right? But there's a whole swathe of different views about how to prioritize the different things. How do you think about balancing those two sorts of visions? Because one of the other areas where I think they come together is in the areas of design and culture and art, because while it's very obvious to focus on alleviating direct physical suffering in something like farmed animal suffering, I don't think that suffering is the only thing that matters. I think that enhancing the quality of sentient experience, including ours as humans, is important as well. So there's, I think, direct, moral value actually in those design questions and those culture questions, those questions of art, that we can also, create moral value now, even while we're trying to alleviate suffering. How do you think about those different fields of thought and, whether we can do both at once or how they interlink? It's tricky questions.
I have to say, this is something that I struggle with. I do think it's hard to justify working too much on promoting flourishing in light of extreme suffering. However, people really devoted to these issues, there's risk of burnout, there's risk of compassion fatigue. There needs to be areas of life that are something to live for, something to hope for, something to cherish. So I don't think everything, every minute should be about addressing suffering every second. However, I would hope that we reach a point where in addressing the most egregious or extreme forms of suffering, that would free up our civilization I think you've even mentioned how, if we can just get the people who are just daily thinking about problems of survival,
Yeah.
if we can just get them to a place where they can focus on self-actualization and projects outside of mere survival, I think that would be an incredible win.
Can you imagine what good the human race could do?
The butterfly effect of that.
Yeah.
Right. And I suppose, like, I'm a big fan of Star Trek.
People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We've eliminated hunger, want. We've grown out of our infancy. The challenge, Mr. Offenhouse, is to improve yourself, to enrich yourself. Enjoy it.
That would be one version of an ideal future where it's post-scarcity. The focus really is on self-actualization, not that of basic needs. And so I would hope that we take that potential seriously and that we do address extreme suffering, but that we also aim to bootstrap that to bring out the best in ourselves and what could be.
It feels compelling to me, and I think it's quite similar to my view, is that the imperative of suffering can feel somewhat overwhelming and is a clear imperative. At the same time, whatever people might think about the human species and the good and the bad we've done, we're probably the only one that has the capability to radically improve things for ourselves and for other sentient life on this planet. So one great way of doing that is, as you've said, freeing ourselves from the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, although as I understand it, he didn't really like the idea of a hierarchy. But those more sort of basic needs, right? Freeing ourselves from the fear and worry about survival and sustenance and security to enable ourselves to tap into that latent compassionate ethics and to leverage our amazing technical abilities to move us towards more of a Star Trek future. And who knows, once we're roaming the galaxy, the range of other sentient beings we might experience and might create.
Yeah, I do hope for a great flourishing of many kinds of sentient beings, many different talents and abilities, and all interrelating and learning and influencing and tolerating each other and improving their quality of life. That would be my hope.
Sounds very good to me. And I think that's one of the strange things. Other sentientists will disagree about exactly what sentience is, but to my mind, it's really just a class of information processing that happens to have evolved in biological entities as a way of modeling the self as an entity in an environment. And this is just what it feels like to run that processing. But one of the fascinating things about that, some might feel that's quite limiting and quite, mundane. Firstly, I'd say, well, it isn't, because the wonder of the experience we're having moment to moment is the only thing that has moral value to me. So I think it's fascinating, and it's almost a privilege to, be part of this bootstrapped information processing architecture. But also what it means is that the potential range of sentient experience could be totally unbounded. So, many humans explore this already through, meditation or different practices or biomedical technology or psychedelics, or, already, even with our current set hardware, thinking about radically different qualities of sentient experience. But as we do even more technical engineering and bioengineering, who knows where we might be able to get to? We might even be able to connect up.
Think of how the internet's transformed. It's a kind of global nervous system in a way.
Yeah.
I would hope that technologies like the internet and whatever comes after it would continue to enhance compassion.
Yeah. Roll on the mind melding.
Yeah.
Well, Graham, that's probably a good place to finish. So we've put the world to rights. We're going to abolish all suffering, open up an unrestricted world of sentient flourishing, the like of which we can't even conceive of today, and roam the galaxies in a Star Trek future. Let's go do it.
Let's do it.
Thank you so much for having the conversation with me today, Graham. What's the best way of people sort of following your thinking and keeping up to date with your work and your future projects?
Yeah, at this point, the best place is Twitter, so we can link that below. Thanks for having me on, Jamie. And I should say that I genuinely think you're doing some amazing work with the project. It's excellent. You're really building community around this idea of evidence and reason and compassion. I wish you the best for the project. And it's a really important project. And you're putting in all this work to really, ensure that moral circle expansion. And it's quite a courageous thing to do. And so I'm really happy that to see people working on this.
Thank you. Well, it's great to have you as part of it. Good to have you on our wall of sentientists on the website. And I really appreciate your help with this project too. Thank you, Grant.
Yeah.
Cool. Take care.
Jamie.
See you.